Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to Albany City Council meeting work session today at 4 p.m. on November 6th. I'd like to call the meeting to order. And do a roll call, please, Allison.
Counselor Smith.
Here.
Counselor McGee.
Present.
Counselor Novak.
She's on the way.
Thank you. Counselor Newton.
Present.
Counselor Kopsinski.
Here.
Counselor Montague.
Here.
Mayor Johnson II.
Here, thank you for the roll call. Next on tonight's agenda is business from the public. Remember that you have 3 minutes to get your points across or share your information. And with that, do we have anybody to sign up to speak this evening? Thank you very much. Anybody in chambers would like to address the council? Hearing none, thank you. We'll move on. Next on tonight's agenda is risk management and investment policies. Garrett Cudahy and Darren Godfrey and Director Yeager.
Good evening. I think Darren Godfrey is going to be attending online, but I'm not sure if he's in yet. Tonight, we have risk management and investment policies. Every year, we review these. We also generally have financial policies that we'll review. However, this year, we're pushing that out a little bit. We have some changes that are going to be coming in January, and so we wanted to wait until those were done before we came forward with our financial policy for you to review. So tonight we have Darren and I think Mike Godfrey, both of you?
Actually, Xander is in Mike's place while Mike's out of the country.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him for the risk management presentation tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor Johnson and City Council and members. Let me share my screen. Can we see that screen?
Yes.
So, from what I understand, we might have some new City Council members sitting in on this meeting, maybe their first meeting. What this meeting is for just an overview report, kind of a 30,000-foot view of the current risk management program in place, both on the property and casualty side and on the workers' compensation side of the business. I believe you all have your packet or have the report in front of you possibly, but I will also share my screen for your view. So on page 1 of this report, this will give you a 5-year history and including the current 2023-2024 policy period, which started July 1st of 2023. This report will just show an overview of the policy premiums, the policy limits, and the policy deductibles if applicable. For the City of Albany, we have all of our property insured through CIS, as well as all lines actually through CIS, including the crime, including bond. So in this overview, we have property, earthquake, flood. Our equipment breakdown coverage is part of our property lines of coverage. We have our crime coverage, our general liability or tort liability, auto liability, auto physical damage, along with some cyber and excess cyber coverage as part of the CIS program. In this report, you'll see the limits of insurance. You'll see, again, the premiums associated with it, deductibles and losses. And further in this report, we can go over a few oversight, 30,000-foot view of some of this information. And then I'll end it with a brief summary and then, of course, questions if you have some after that. We also have our airport liability for the city airport. All of our bonds for the public officials are included in the CIS crime policy. And then we have a voluntary worker or voluntary accident policy in place for our volunteers. And that's not to say that this is for our volunteers covered by our workers' compensation policy through state. This is just a separate monoline volunteer accident policy. So with the property, this is a 5-year look, including 2023, 2024. Obviously, it's just started. You can see where the property premiums have been trending. And obviously in the 2022-23 policy period to the 23-24 policy period, you'll see a fairly decent sized jump in premium. This is associated with reinsurance treaties that the insurance company has to negotiate, and the cost of reconstruction in value. So we took this year in 2023-24 policy period, we took about a $17,226,000 limit increase, and that's due to City Insurance Services. They trend the property values this past year by 7%. So it's almost like what we call an inflation guard that is built into the property form. That, with about a 16% rate increase this past year, CIS took a hefty rate increase for all members that buy property insurance from CIS. Our liability trended up about 9% this past year over prior year. And losses have yet to accumulate in the current policy term, but you can see that the liability losses in the prior year were about $159,515. So fairly profitable this past year, and this year has so far started off on a good start. The next slides are basic slides that show where the liability claims are coming from in terms of, a per department type basis. So you'll see that somewhat equal shares coming from public works and police. And so this will give a breakdown of just where the losses for liability, where those losses are being generated. Same with the auto liability. Shows premium, shows a comparison, shows the losses, and a breakdown of those losses by department. You'll see public works tends to have, and police tend to have, more auto liability losses due to the nature of their business, whether it's by the police department, street sweepers, large buses, other things, other transportation pieces that make it difficult, given how many people are parked on the street. We have a lot of those types of incidences. Next screen shows basically our auto physical damage premiums and claims. Up until this past couple months, we were fairly under control when it came to our auto physical damage claims, but we did have a large loss in the last couple months to one of the city street sweepers, and it spiked our claim history up immediately for the current policy term that we're in. Again, where our losses coming from? Physical damage losses are coming from our public works department.
I do have a question. Is that
Yeah.
spike, with the 174 on page 17? Is that a single loss, or is it multiple losses built into that?
Yeah, we had a street sweeper that was totaled recently. And so our physical damage claim on that claim was, I think, paid out just a little over about $155,000 on that one loss.
Okay,
So it was a shock loss. It was not a frequency issue, but definitely, a severity issue.
thank you.
Yeah. This gives a breakdown of a 5-year history, not including the 23-24 policy term. And this will show the number of claims that we're averaging per year, the incurred claims cost averaging per year, and the average cost per claim. So this will give you a pretty good oversight that over the last 5 years, we incurred a little over $1 million in losses on 118 claims, and where those losses came from, whether it was auto liability, whether it's the physical damage of the auto, the liability or tort liability, and the property. Property's been very, very profitable, and we just haven't had any property losses. So that's where a lot of the property rates and the rate increases are coming from. What we're in right now, just as an oversight, kind of a summary, is that catastrophic losses right now are driving insurance costs on property. Wildfires are causing a huge issue with the reinsurance, and our large cat losses. I think we had like 176 hurricanes last year, which was way above average. So we're taking a lot of property losses throughout the U.S. And those are having an indirect, result to reinsurance costs. And right now, CIS is in the middle of negotiating their reinsurance, and are trying to tell us what to tell our members to budget for. But in summary, I don't believe that one, rates are coming down. I think that for budgetary purposes, and we can go into detail later with the team, we're seeing that property is taking about a 15% rate increase from CIS, and about 10% on auto liability and auto physical damage premiums. So for budgetary purposes, right now I'm telling my members for next year, it's hard to give an estimation, a crystal ball look at it, but the way things have been trending with reinsurance issues, we're budgeting about 15% property, and again, 10% on the auto side. It's a little disheartening, but these losses are just adding up throughout the U.S. for all carriers. It's not just CIS and its members. That's what I have in terms of the property and casualty side. Xander Darcy is with me in place of Mike Godfrey. And Darcy can talk to you a little bit about the workers' comp and just an overview of that.
Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well this afternoon. Thanks for having me. As Darren had mentioned, I'll be covering the workers' comp portion of this presentation. And just like the property casualty, it's a 5-year overview of kind of where the city of Albany is. We'll start with standard premium. As you can see by the graphs, it's been going down from 2018 to 2023. Standard premium, has been right around the 900,000, 925,000 mark last year and this year as well. Rates in general with SAFE are staying, they're pretty solid. We don't expect any jumps for the 2024 year. So every year some payroll class codes go down, others go up. The two that we do expect a small increase on for the 24 year is with the fire and police departments. Across the board, most cities are seeing a small 2 to 3% increase coming up for the 24 year, just because they typically have the most exposure. So that's not uncommon for workers' comp to see. As we get further in, you'll see that's where most of the claims are being driven. Regarding, the performance number of claims, as you can see from the last few years, City of Albany's done really well in terms of managing their claims and their frequency. The 22 year, they had less claims than were expected, and their incurred costs were really quite great at that 19%. For 2023, the number of claims that were right at expected. So there's not necessarily like a frequency issue as it comes to the city of Albany. They are having the amount of claims that SAFE has kind of expected up to this point. And whenever you're looking at incurred costs when it comes to workers' compensation, just keep in mind that that also includes the reserves that SAFE has set for those claims, as they are required to set reserves for the ultimate probable costs of the claim. And so when we're looking at those,
I have a
the
quick
one
question.
thing- Yep.
So looking at number of claims for 2022, where are we currently sitting for 2023? And incurred costs for 2022 is not mapped here. Is there a reason for that?
I'm sorry, the incurred costs is at the 19%.
No, I mean, on 2022, the graph, it says incurred costs. 2022 is not represented there.
Well, it's because if you look down below, the incurred cost says 19%, and it's such a small figure for how large this graph goes up, is why it's not really showing anything.
So there were
Because-
claims though.
Yeah, they
Okay.
were really low for the
Right.
22 year.
Thank you.
They were expected to have 35 claims for the 22 year, and the total was 27. So really nice job of managing that risk.
Thank you.
No problem. The one thing I do want to note for the 2023 year is, as Darren had mentioned, there was a Sweet Streeper accident, and SAFE had not yet set the reserves for that claim when this report was created. They just recently did that. So there will be a spike in terms of the incurred and paid to standard costs, because he did suffer some pretty severe injuries as it relates to that accident. So it's something I just wanted to caution you guys that, when you get the next report, you'll likely see where that increase is.
Thank you.
As it relates to the experience mod, currently for the 2023 year, we're at a 1.09. The way that NCCI determines the experience mod is they look at frequency and severity, and then they compare, the city of Albany to another city with the same amount of payroll, same size. And 1.0 is what they would consider average. As you can tell, from 2018, we were up at a 1.16, and we're currently at a 1.09, same as last year. Good news is, for the 24 year, we are estimating that the city of Albany should be right at 1 or possibly under by a couple percentage points. The way that affects your premium is anything over a 1 is going to be a debit towards the premium. So in this case, it's 9% more because it's a 1.09. Whereas in 24, we do anticipate it likely to be right around a 0.98. So there'll be that 2% credit rather than a debit charge on the experience mod as it relates to the city of Albany. We're definitely trending in the right direction. Same with the paid to standard loss ratio. The underwriters love to see that right around that 40% mark. And claim frequency performing right where we expect a city of your size to be performing. So again, a really nice job in that regard in terms of how the city of Albany is managing their risk. And then the next slide for me, Darren. Again, workers' comp by department. This is the last 5 years, as expected. City or the fire and police department are, the most high exposures. That's where we see the most claims. And this is nothing uncommon for a city in any regard. And then the public works and parks and rec are usually the other two that kind of are the driving claims costs as it relates to workers' comp and for a public entity like yourself. So, but that's everything in a nutshell. I mean, SAFE is doing really well. They did announce that $135 million dividend last September. So the city of Albany was able to, get that back as well. And we still don't anticipate any huge increases when it comes to rates or premium for the city of Albany. Everything is, they're doing what they should be doing when it comes to work comp.
So the only changes that we had in the policy this year was we updated the workers' comp limits. We didn't have those in there before. And I did want to note too that we actually explored another insurance company providing coverage for us. And correct me if I'm wrong, Darren, but once they found out that we owned property jointly with Millersburg, they no longer wanted to do business with us.
Yeah, what we tried to do is we went back to Travelers, and they were really trying to push a public entity, insurance program. We went back to them, we tried to get a competitive option to what we're currently doing. And because of those ownership or co-ownerships of Millersburg, and I believe it was the water, that it basically put Travelers out of the mix in terms of being competitive and the ability to quote. So we did try alternatives. There just weren't any alternatives.
Who's covering those? Which company is covering them? CIS or somebody else? Or-
Yeah, City Insurance Services, CIS.
Okay, so Travels is out of the picture for those properties?
Travelers
They're
is
out of the picture. Yeah, they were on the property at one point in the past, but haven't been for a while now.
Thank you.
I will say one additional comment that I did make is, we work diligently with the safety department, and we have our quarterly meetings with Chuck and the group. They're doing a fabulous job. They're doing great work there. They're open to any type of risk management ideas, any type of training. It's been a pretty good partnership, and they've done. I just want to say they've just done a great job.
Thank you. Is that it? Director?
That's it for me.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Darren.
Bob.
Thanks, Xander.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have our investment policy, and we have Garrett Cudahy here from GPA, which is Government Portfolios Advisors. They help us out with our investments. Garrett is ready to answer questions and present. He has a ton of information, so if you have any questions, he's much better at answering those than I would be.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you, everybody. Let me just get logged into Zoom here to share materials. While this is loading, I'm mindful of your time. This is your time tonight, so please interrupt me at any point if you have any questions or want to stop or ask anything along the way. Just take a little longer than expected. Why don't we get going on the recommended policy change? I think you have that in your packet. It's really benign. We're just looking to get a little bit more operating flexibility as we seek to optimize your resources. So with this rising interest rate cycle, what had really happened was we were able to purchase securities in the market like treasury bills that out-yielded your options at a bank or the LGIP. But in doing so, we incrementally expand your maturity, weighted average maturity, and we realized that 1.75 years was actually a constraint. And we haven't had a cycle like this since 1970s and the early 80s, so that was kind of a learning lesson. So we're seeking to expand that across clients just marginally. So 2 years is still very constrained, but again, it just gives us a little bit of flexibility to disintermediate the banks that don't want to pay and other entities that are lagging behind. So I don't know if there's any questions on that. It looks like my computer's trying to do a pretty healthy
Reset it.
update here.
What is that? It's like a fan. I can hear it.
I can go ahead and ask a question while we're waiting.
Yes, please.
So, and if it was in here, I did not see it, but when you invest money from a certain fund, do the monies earned have to go back to that fund, or do they become fungible at that point?
Not necessarily. So interest is really a management decision unless it's specifically called out like in a grant agreement of some sort where any of the interest that's associated with that. And the way that we allocate interest is based on fund balance. So, but it really is a management decision on how to allocate interest.
That gives you some flexibility. That's nice.
It does.
Yeah.
Were we investing enterprise funds? That money would have to go back in those particular funds, correct?
So again, it's based on fund balances. So the way that we allocate it is we look at what the fund balance is for each of those funds. And it's a weighted percentage. So, those funds, the enterprise funds tend to be pretty big. And they tend to have a lot of reserves in place. So they do get quite a bit of the interest.
So my question was, if I invest money from this enterprise fund and the dividends go back in that fund, is that correct?
It doesn't have to.
It doesn't have
It's,
to?
no, it's a management decision on how the investments go unless it's specifically called out in a grant agreement or some other agreement, then it is a management decision.
Thank you. Coming back up yet?
We are,
May I ask a quick follow-up question? When you say management decision, is that your decision or Peter's decision or the two of you together? Which management are we referring to?
Well, it's usually, it's generally the finance director's
Okay,
position, but, we work closely with Peter in making decisions and policies but he's not a finance guy, so.
You're the finance girl, thank you.
all right, my computer's cooperating now. So this is what we just discussed. I don't know if there's any questions about the policy change.
Can you make that any bigger?
Sure.
You're doing,
Readers.
not Rita's couldn't help me with this thing. I have my presentation, I got it though.
Okay. All right. Oh, there we go.
Oh, go ahead and go up, please. I don't want to hold you up.
Okay.
Getting smaller.
Is it spinning?
Yeah.
It says not responding up at the top of the screen.
Yeah, we're having some fun IT.
So actually, it's on page 23 of our packet, I believe.
Do they have this in here?
Maturity constraints, minimum percentage of total portfolio. Better.
There we go.
There we go.
No questions? All right.
Walk us through what we're looking at here.
So this is that change where in the current policy, your weighted average maturity for your entire program is 1.75 years. And what we're asking or seeking is to move that up to 2 years to give us that operating flexibility.
I see, recommended. We'll be talking about this again on Wednesday?
Well, it was going to be on the consent agenda on Wednesday. But, if you have additional questions, I'm sure we'd be able to answer them.
So just to be clear, this is the only change. Everything else is the same as it was last year, correct? Okay.
Questions? Thank you.
Okay.
Get the answer you asked. When you get the answer to your question, hang up the phone and move on.
We will move on. So this is actually the fun part, and I'll go through this pretty briefly, but again, stop me if we have questions because it's been quite the unusual time. So we're going to cover a little bit of what's going on in the markets, the economy, It's been a wild few years ever since COVID beset us in 2020. And then we'll touch on the portfolio, what's going on there, what are we doing, what changes are we seeing? Good news is you're earning more money. The suspect news is how long do we get to enjoy that before we go back to probably a little bit more reality. But so far, it's been a much more resilient economy than expected, and we're starting to see some stabilization. The real good storyline there is one of those bullet points about inflation's come down much more rapidly than anybody had thought, especially without economic harm, which, knock on wood, we continue that. But why we're starting to see stabilization is we're now seeing the consumer enjoy positive real wage growth. That is, wage growth is now growing on a monthly basis faster than prices. So a lot of people don't find comfort in that. Inflation is coming down. That doesn't mean prices come down. It means the rate of change of prices cools and slows. So that's what we're seeing. I think another topic we'll touch on is this, what we call higher for longer. And that is the sense that maybe the Federal Reserve can have rates higher and we can sustain higher interest rates than what we previously thought. My thought there is no, I don't believe that's the case at all. Look at mortgage rates and look at affordability of housing. These things don't square very nicely. I just think we haven't felt them yet, largely because the consumer came into this inflationary environment with a lot of pent-up savings with stimulus efforts and whatnot. So they were better able to weather the storm than in past cycles where they more immediately feel the impact of rising rates. Then the last one, geopolitical tensions. I don't think I really need to pretend to be a geopolitical expert, but these are wild cards that have been popping up more frequently than usual. And we just must be on guard that if those escalations continue, there can be economic and, of course, market ramifications. So this is just a look at the interest rate curve. And really the higher for longer is what happened on the right side of the chart. So you look at interest rates kind of beyond the 3-year maturity all the way out to the 30-year maturity. Those went spiking higher over the summer months because the economy was more resilient is one issue. Two, the federal government continues to expand the deficit, which now looks to be about $1.7 trillion or 6% of GDP. Well, that money has to come from somewhere to clear this market, and that meant lower prices in bonds, higher prices in yields. But you'll see on the very far left of the chart is those yields really didn't move. Those are the very short-dated Fed-sensitive yields, and that's because the Federal Reserve has stopped their rate hiking campaign. They just paused here last week. I expect that they are done, and the next move will be cuts, whether it's a recession or whether it's fine-tuning to be determined. But I don't expect these longer-term yields to hang in there for very much longer. In fact, last week they went plummeting down about 30 or 40 basis points from where you see it because we saw a slowing labor economy and, again, a Fed that looks to be less aggressive going forward. Here's a look at inflation. This is just headline CPI, consumer price inflation. It reached a high of 9.1% a year ago. It would not have gone that high if it were not for the Russia-Ukraine conflict that sent commodity prices of all kinds skyrocketing. It's such a major source of grain, fertilizer, and of course, oil and gas. But here's the good news. We're now in the mid 3% range, and it looks set to continue coming down. And why is housing? Housing has lagged coming in and out of inflation by about 12 to 18 months. We know the housing market of right now is not nearly as hot as a year ago. And right now, the month-over-month readings of inflation, 60 to 70% of that is housing. So to us, that's kind of a phantom figure. We know that the math is going to change directions there. So all signs point toward continued progress here. This is just looking at core inflation where we strip out the volatile commodities. And I'd like to look at a 3-month, 6-month, and 12-month moving average. I think that really illustrates that the most recent experience of the last 3 and 6 months, we're turning the corner mathematically speaking. The monthly reads continue to be very benign. In fact, that 3-month moving average is right back squarely at the Fed's target of roughly 2%. In fact, with housing coming in next year much softer, you may actually undershoot and have a deflationary reading, which would be, I think, a welcome sign for everybody in America. This chart here, the orange line is really the focus, and this is where you take core CPI and you exclude housing, knowing that that is lagged, and that is right back in the middle of the Fed's target. That's 1.8%. So again, we see the non-housing components look very, very good. So the readings there are encouraging as well. And I don't expect housing to be a problem, and why is really the rental market is what caused a lot of this. We know with 8% mortgage rates, housing affordability is not good for buying a home, but rents really surged during COVID. There was a supply-demand mismatch, and that has come back in balance. You're seeing the top right chart, nationally speaking, Vacancy rates are back up where they were pre-COVID. You can see in the top left, year-over-year rent growth is now negative. And the bottom left, I think, is really surprising, is that most major markets, of the 100 major markets, over 70% of them are experiencing negative year-over-year rental growth. And we expect that to continue. And why is there was a real boom. If you want to talk about where a bubble might be in this market, it was in multifamily construction when mortgage rates went to 3% and there was stimulus money going around the world and rents were growing at 10, 15, 20%. A lot of people put a shovel in the ground and started building apartment buildings, and those are still in the pipeline. So what you're looking at here is the annualized run rate of apartments coming online in America, and that's about 1 million units per year. So that is still going to happen. Those are in progress, not open for rent yet. But that makes any time period in 05, 06, 07, the run up to the housing crisis, look small in comparison. So we expect this housing situation will have a lid on it in terms of rents. Wages are also coming back down. This is one area that if I'm going to be concerned about me thinking inflation has turned the corner, it is here. Simply put, if you're earning 4% per year in wages, you can afford inflation above 2%. It's pretty simple mathematics there. I don't think this will really improve, and it's mostly demographics, and I have a slide that talks about it. But they are declining, and the good news is with inflation now having a 3 handle, and I think moving toward a 2 next year, then wage negotiations, of course, lag that. So you're going to have a lot less pressure from unions and wage earners of saying, hey, I need more just to afford my standard of living. So I do expect them to continue to moderate, but I don't think they're coming back to 2. And why is this slide here? I say you could blame the boomers. They were such a large cohort in America, just population-wise, and there's nothing that they like more than rate hikes and high interest rates as they're about to go into retirement. That's kind of the nirvana scenario for them. So when you look at labor force participation broadly, that is the orange line, that's yet to recover the pre-COVID levels. There's less people engaging the labor market today than right before the pandemic, but you can't blame the youngsters anymore. That's the blue line. That's working age population, the 25 to 55 cohort. That's at a 30-year high, which makes sense because you can't afford to have kids, you can't afford to have a house. If you don't have a lot of people engaging the labor market, everybody needs to more or less be a dual income household to have a middle class or above lifestyle right now. But that top line, the 55 plus cohort, that is where all of the drag is clearly coming from, and there's such a large group. I don't expect them to come back, right? They're not gonna go from a 5% interest rate environment with all the wealth that they've accumulated and go be a Walmart greeter because of a tough economy or a tough year. I think their ship is sailing, and that will impact that wage dynamic because there's gonna be just more pressure for labor. I know it's probably a sore spot here at the city because hiring has been tough, but I expect it to continue to be so. Really interesting, so why do we have, this is a really leading economic indicator index, so it gathers just a whole bunch of data and just throws it in kind of a weighting system of how important it is to the economy. And this has always been a really good leading indicator of where the economy is. And by all these measures, we should be in a recession. So this is kind of what I call the LEI lie of how is it possible that we have this resilient economy that keeps chugging along when everything you look at underneath the hood says we should be struggling more. And to me, this is another one of those kind of, I don't think this time is different. I don't think we've defied gravity this time. I just think that the dynamics around excess savings coming into this inflationary problem is making those Fed rate hikes, the lagged impact of them, further out on the horizon. I think they're still coming. Again, you can look at the auto market. They're very rate sensitive. We're selling 15.5 million autos a year in America right now. Usually that's about 18 million. And I don't expect that to continue with interest rates where they are. So you can see those signs in housing and auto, the very directly, immediately rate sensitive sectors. So I think it's just a matter of time before the consumer becomes a little bit more exhausted and makes the Fed relent on their policy, which I expt starting next year.
Can I ask a question, two questions? You were saying that because these, why am I now spacing on the word I'm thinking? Inflation was going to be lower, but then that we still didn't have as many people, and you said inflation would be lower, so people probably wouldn't be negotiating as much for salaries. But then you went on to say about 3 minutes later that there were less people participating in the job market. Can you please clarify, because that seems counterintuitive?
Sure, well, there's the cost of living increases that people like to negotiate, and then there's just the general supply demand for labor mobility. Those two things are generally kind of separate. Inflation may or may not impact the tightness of a labor market. So a durably tight labor market, which demographically I think is going to happen, will take the natural run rate of just wages, inflation, or cost of living aside, a level higher than previous, right? So that used to be about 2.5. Now I think it's probably gonna be 3.5, 4.5. Now the cost of living component is usually buckled on top of that kind of competitive landscape. And so, yeah, last year or two, when inflation was 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, there was a demand on top of that, kind of natural wage increases people want to see every year because they're smarter, more experienced, right? I think that's going to come down. That component will come down.
Also, where from Bloomberg and Wells Fargo were you getting that people's savings has increased since the, stimulus? Because I don't know, what was like less than, I think it was like, what, $4,000? That's not a make or break amount for anyone, especially with, as you mentioned, housing prices being really expensive and food and rent. I really, from what I read previously with like Americans, their savings accounts are actually much more depleted. So I just wanted to clarify and understand where your data was coming from.
Sure. We actually have a slide directly touching on the savings, but a lot of it also was people were spending less because they couldn't engage the services economy. So a lot of it was not just the stimulus, but they weren't going on vacations, they weren't going to concerts, they weren't driving to work, right?
They were getting
Childcares
laid
were-
off, though.
Sure. Granted, but definitely we noticed, and I think the chart is, we can fast forward to it. At one point in the economy, there was right here just empirically 2.1 trillion more in people's savings accounts than what we would normally experience. So that is that accumulated stimulus efforts, lack of spending that was going on in the economy that had naturally built up. And I think one very interesting and of course social topic around this is the distribution of it was not equal, right? The PPP loans and some of that definitely accrued to the top quartile or top 10%. So the distribution, the bottom half, I don't have a chart for that here today, but they are definitely back below where they were pre-pandemic. They are the first to get exhausted with food prices, energy prices, because more of their budget, more of their income goes to those components, right? But broadly speaking, why is the economy still upright with inflation and with the rate hikes? It's this chart here. We came into it with a giant cushion in aggregate, right? Not every income strata, not every wealth strata benefited equally for sure. Right, but this is, well, that's broadly, that's at the trillions, that's a broad aggregate number, that's 2.1 trillion, not per individual. But you can see this has run down a lot, and we do expect this to be exhausted this fall.
Can I just piggyback on that as well? Because I represent a lot of people who don't automatically get a COLA or any other kind of wage raise. And I also shop for food on a regular basis. We used to run a restaurant. And I can tell you from experience in the restaurant world, our prices have way skyrocketed in the last few years. And you can call it an LEI lie, but in my reality, prices have skyrocketed, and we couldn't raise our prices commensurate with how they've been raised on us. And I'm speaking for an awful lot of people. I do understand that there are many people who have an entitlement or many entitlements, and they are not hurting. But I know many, many, many people like myself who don't receive those things and never have and never will. And it's concerning. It's very concerning. Every time we raise a rate of any kind, it's very concerning, because I hear from people and I know my own situation. So I appreciate Councillor Newton bringing it up, and I just want to speak out again on behalf of the people, many of whom I walk in their shoes. And you need to hear that there are many people who are not floating through everything post-COVID, who were completely devastated by COVID, who lost businesses during COVID. And I don't know, that's all I wanted to say. I just want to
yeah,
say it's,
no doubt,
it's
I
not
agree.
as shiny as a lot of statistics would have you believe.
Correct, no doubt, you're right, absolutely. And that's why the Fed is so aggressive at doing this, because they realize inflation hurts everyone, right? A bump in the stock market only hurts a little bit of people. So they are willing to put that damage through, which they did last year, in order to make sure that everybody's all right. And it disproportionately hurts the least well off, right? That is absolutely true because of that budget and propensity to spend. They have to spend, they have to consume that. They can't benefit from rising rates or whatnot. But the LEI lie, or what I'm saying here, is that the underlying economy does not look that robust, right? When you strip out all those things. And I think that's to your point. There is real struggle going on without a doubt.
Thank you.
But in aggregate, the economy somehow is still making it. And again, I think it is that savings stock that's still built up. It just cushioned us
Yes, there are
In
people who
aggregate.
have savings.
In aggregate,
And I'm sure
correct.
that's true, and I'm sure they're fine.
Correct. So skipping ahead, the other thing that's going to come online this fall is student loans. It just happened again. If I'm the Federal Reserve, I'm pretty happy about this, to be quite frank, and the reason is, if you're to look at where residual stickiness in the inflation basket is, it's in the non-housing services like recreation, leisure travel is hot. So that has been hotels, airfare, dining out. But if you kind of think about a cross-section of who engages in those activities, it's a lot of those people also have student loans. It tends to be higher than average income, kind of that middle-aged cohort. Well, the party's over. They had 3 years of not having to pay their student loans, which also added to the excess savings story because they didn't have to pay on their debts. Same with the mortgage deferments. But that is now coming back online, and we expect that to dent consumption as we enter the fall. This is a really interesting chart. This is a benefit to you guys. I will briefly just say what I'm trying to portray here. The green line is where the Fed is today. The orange line is where the Fed wants to be in terms of interest rates in an equilibrium economy. That's 2.5%, not 5.5%. And the market thinks that the Fed won't get there. That's 4.5%. That's what the black line is. So that's a benefit to what you're doing as investors, because I have full confidence that the Federal Reserve will get the job done. They absolutely have to get the job done to address exactly what you're talking about, the socioeconomic issues of America if you don't get inflation under control. So we do expect that green line to eventually converge back with that orange line. The problem is the timing and the path. What's the catalyst that gets us there? Is it inflation keeps cooling and they're able to gradually cut back? That's what we call the soft landing narrative you might hear in the media. Or is it more, we actually do have a recession, these leading indicators were not lying to us, and therefore the Fed ends up cutting to help the economy out. But we have a lot of faith and confidence that green line will eventually converge with the orange line in due time. Is that a year? Is that 6 months? Is that 2 years? Timing uncertain. But the good news is you're investing based on the green and the black line today, and the market's going to calibrate back toward that orange line, which is good for folks like yourself with your portfolio.
Would you do me a favor? Go back to that slide. You have to lean in really far to see these with my eyes. So we can make them a little thicker next time. I'd appreciate it.
For sure. Lastly, I'll be remiss without reminding us that every time that the Fed does do an over-tightening campaign, which they are, something breaks. That's usually the recession. There's only been one soft landing in the history of the Federal Reserve. That was 94, 95 under then Greenspan. So we thought that might have been the banks that failed in March, but we have since breezed through that thanks to a bailout the Federal Reserve is currently doing to smooth over the banking crisis. But as you can see, the history is pretty clear that anytime you get above a longer-term trend of federal funds rates, something does typically go wrong. So the longer we are here, that is problematic, and that is why we are all wanting inflation to cure itself and continue coming down so the Fed can glide itself back down and not have the oops moment that forces them back down. But history, unfortunately, odds are low that we actually do have the soft landing. I don't mean for this to be scary, but I will end with talking about the federal deficit because it's pretty remarkable, but it's pretty simple mathematics. Again, if you have $34 trillion of debt outstanding and interest rates are 5%, voila, that means you have a $1.6 trillion per year interest outlay to service the said debt. And that's what's going on at the federal level. The longer the Federal Reserve is here, it is absolutely choking out and increasing the deficit at the federal level. So everybody really wants this to happen pretty quickly. That is resolving inflation to the Fed's comfort level so that we can revert course. By virtue of like some sort of a scale, the entire defense budget's just under $1 trillion. So we are spending more on interest than we do our entire defense budget, which of course is an astronomical number to begin with. But the scary part about the chart on the top is if we don't cure interest rates and get them lower back toward that equilibrium level, that blue shaded area is you're going to issue debt just to pay off interest on your outstanding debt. As we all know in personal finance, if you pay your minimum on your credit card, it just keeps going up and up and up and up, right? It's not sustainable. Eventually that breaks. I'm an optimist. We won't face this. One way or another, we will cure this. Or just like what has happened in Japan, and they are fine. Their central bank owns half of their outstanding government debt. Interest rates are very low. That's not a great outcome, but it's an outcome that's not catastrophic. So you hear a lot in the press about this. I'm not overly alarmed, but this is happening. The mechanics are in place right now, and the Federal Reserve is actually actively selling treasuries, not buying them. So it's a dicey time until we can get rates back down to a more comfortable level at the federal budget. And this just goes to show how unusual that is. It's very rare to have a low unemployment rate and a high deficit, because usually you only deficit spend when the economy needs you to deficit spend to get it out of control. So the point with this chart is, if we are to go into a recession, which people aren't forecasting, this budget's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. You could see kind of wartime spending or COVID type of deficits happening. And that leads me to this point, is who's going to buy them? If you need to issue $2 trillion of securities per year and the Federal Reserve is no longer doing it, you are needing to pull money out from somewhere. And unfortunately, with foreign demand is weakening quite substantially. One, because of kind of the weaponization of the dollar with the Russia-Ukraine conflict is leading OPEC members and China in particular. Unfortunately, they're the ones with the budget surpluses that can afford to buy them. They are shying away. We can see that in the data. So we kind of need the Fed to get over with this rate cycle, and eventually they need to be net buyers back in this market again, or this is going to have knock-on effects to capital formation throughout the economy. So this is something that we are quite worried about, is who's going to be the marginal buyer, because if you need to have yields keep increasing, that's not a sustainable path in order to entice capital in. So this is a story I think is going to play out over the next 5 or 10 years. And that's really where I want to leave it. I know we had a good lively conversation. I don't know if there's any other questions or comments before we move into the portfolio. Yep, perfect. Go through this pretty quickly here. We're going to start with the compliance report. So you guys are currently compliant and have been compliant the entire time with statute and with policy. So we measure this every day in real time. Right here, I just want to focus, a lot of these numbers might not make sense to a lot of people, but in the top right box, your earnings yield on your portfolio, no shocker here, they're going up dramatically and they continue to go up. And that is a function of us maturing out old securities that had very low yields and engaging the current market yields. That's going to accelerate over the next 12 months as we continue that behavior. And then on the bottom right, the portfolio is in an unrealized loss position. That's simple bond mathematics, where the yields that we own the securities at is less than where the market is. So you just have a mathematical equation that you're in an unrealized loss position. We won't realize those. We will mature the bonds back at par, and there will be no losses actually realized. But I just want to highlight that and make sure that nobody is confused or is understanding how that works out. And just like after COVID, when yields went plummeting, you had unrealized gains. We didn't harvest those either. We're buy and hold investors. We're going to hold these to maturity in conjunction with our cash flow forecasting needs. This just shows your balances over the last year. Good news is you're moving up in the world. Some of that seasonality, of course, is with property taxes and turnover, but your balances have increased. And now with interest rates actually earning money, naturally your balances are going to keep increasing until this cycle kind of cools down in rates. This is a high-level look at your portfolio. At the quarter end, you had $26 million in liquidity, that's cash, and at the state LGIP, and you had about $123 million in investments. And by function of where are we and where are we going, you can look at the book yield and the market yield. The book yield of 3.12% is where you own them today. The current market yield of reflecting that portfolio is 4.94%. So our job over the next 12 months is to close that delta out. And once we do, that's when those unrealized losses vanish. And should we flip the other direction, that's when gains actually happen, is when your book yield is ahead of your market yield. This is just a quick look at your earnings. Good news is we are earning a lot more interest income than we have in a long time. So obviously 5% interest rates on a $120 million portfolio, that becomes real money. That's north of $5 million. And we're starting to see that mechanics work out, and interest income is helping the budget as we speak. It's just a cross-section of your maturity profile. It's more just for disclosure. I don't really have anything to add here. And I want to end it here unless there's any questions. It's just performance. So the dark blue line is what your portfolio is earning net of any fees that ourselves or custody banks charge you. And then that light blue line is what a benchmark that kind of replicates what we have done passively in the market. And the good news is net of fees, we're still earning our keep, which is our goal and is what our job is. So all is good there. And you can see finally we have positive returns. So the last year we're up 3%. So again, we're really turning that corner, and with that natural start of 5% yields, and we expect that to continue at least for the next few years. And with that, I'll open up to any questions anybody has.
Questions, council? Counselor Kopczynski, you have any questions?
I'm okay.
I think we're good. Thank you.
Perfect.
So Counselor Novak, I just wanted to quickly circle back to you. When you were asking about who makes decisions about the interest allocations, it is part of our policy. So if you look on page 31 of your agenda, where it talks about pooling of funds, that talks about how to maximize our investment earnings, we pool the cash together over the entire city and then allocate based on, as they call it, participation, but it's basically fund balance, unless there's something specific like a grant or something that we have to make sure we're allocating a certain percentage to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director. Garrett, thank you also.
Thank you.
Next is Ron Irish on the pedestrian crossing Expo Parkway at Knox Butte. The verbal.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. You've had a long presentation already. I know there's another one following me, so I'm going to make this as brief as I can possibly make it, I think. So a few months ago, you got a request from a property owner on Expo Parkway north of Knox Butte, Wanda Sheeler, who made a request to install a crosswalk and a pedestrian-activated flashing light system across Knox Butte at Expo Parkway. You asked staff to take a look at that, bring you back some comments. Your schedule has been pretty busy since then, so this is our first opportunity to come back. The short story is it's not a bad location for a crosswalk and an RRFB, which is the ped-activated light system. Expo Parkway is the location in our Transportation System Plan, or TSP, for a future traffic signal. So ultimately, there will be a signal there that would provide protected crossings. The problem is we don't know when that will happen. It's not in our 5-year CIP. We don't exactly know what the trigger might be for that construction. Could be ODOT redoing the interchange, could be development of the regional commercial site on the northeast corner of the interchange. Could be something else, but we don't know if that's 5 years out, 10 years out, or longer. So an RFB would provide better crossing movements there. So the short story is not a bad location. The longer story is that, RFBs are something that we've looked at citywide last time, I think, in 2017. And the council asked the Traffic Safety Commission to come up with a prioritized list of locations, present it to council. The TSC came up with a list of about 18 spots. Council looked at it, agreed with the locations, but directed staff, as opposed to moving forward actively to construct any of those, rather look for targets of opportunity. And that would be, if we have a street project in the area, add it to the street project. If there's a nearby development project, we might be able to apply a condition, do that. If there's a grant opportunity, look for those. And so we have done all of those three things at various locations in town. And using that method, we've probably built about half of what was on that original list. But in very few cases, if any, have we targeted a specific intersection. Knox Butte and Expo isn't on the current list. And so my advice to you is to take the issue of RFBs, refer it back this time to the Transportation Advisory Commission, ask them to update the RRFB list, in particular look at Expo and Parkway, make an effort at some level of prioritization, and then bring it back to council. And with that list, you would be able then to look citywide and decide if you want to, once again, look for just targets of opportunity, or if there are 1 or 2 locations where you think they're important enough that we should make an effort to redirect funds and look at that particular spot. But you'd be making that decision looking at the system as opposed to just one intersection. And so the staff recommendation is to kick it to the TAC for recommendation. We'd bring it back to you at the next meeting after that. And I can stop and answer questions if you have them.
I think that's a great idea myself.
Could I get just a review? I mean, I understand Ms. Sheila is here, and the request was because they have a lot of accidents, potential accidents, whatever. I don't want someone to die in order for us to put the crosswalk up. So I don't mind kicking it to the TSP, but how much time are we looking at for them to review it and get it back to us?
They meet monthly. So they met a couple of weeks ago. So I would expect it would take you about a month. We'd hit their next meeting and come back with a list after that. So my guess is you'd be looking at about a month.
Mid-December.
probably.
A question over here. Did that answer your question,
Yes, it did, thank you.
Counselor Smith?
The signal, the pedestrian signal on Waverly Drive at Periwinkle Creek, was that on that original list of 18?
The one just south of Grand Prairie?
Yeah,
It was.
okay.
And we have, I think, the request at Knox Butte and Expo Parkway is the first one that I know of that has come directly from the public to council since 2017. Staff has received several. So I know that we have received requests, I've received requests at Grand Prairie at Davidson, what I think is where that Periwinkle Path is opposite the park on the south side. That's currently on the list, but that was a request we got. Geary at 21st, we've received requests for that one. That's also on the list. Expo Parkway and Knox Butte at the moment is not.
So it's been 5 years since that report was done? You said
That's
18?
2017 is what
2017,
what I
so it's
heard.
almost 6 years.
2017 was when the
6 years.
TSC last made their recommendation.
We should probably, yeah, we should probably.
Yeah,
go back.
I agree. I think that
And
they
and we
can
have
take
we have
that.
got roughly half of what they had proposed has been built or in the process of being built.
What did you call that priority list again?
It was a prioritized list of potential RRFB locations.
RRF.
Rapid rectangular flashing beacon, I did not name them. But
I just
that's,
didn't know what it meant. Okay,
Acronym
thank you.
for everything.
Right?
that's what
I'm
ODOT
a,
calls
I'm
it.
a military guy, so it's like, I didn't know what that one stood for. Thank you. So council, we okay with thumbs up, going back, bringing it back to us?
Yeah.
Thank
As
you,
long
Ron.
as it's
Thank you.
Street preservation and improvement funding. Director Bailey, page 38 through 41 in your packet. This is gonna be a long presentation?
Yep.
Let's take 10 minutes for a bio break, please.
Thank you. I'm here with Chris Serkluski, who's one of our senior engineers, and he's going to actually kick things off, and then I'll pick it up later. So turn it over to
Don't
Chris.
say later.
Alrighty, good evening. We're back, as we said we'd be. Today we're gonna talk some more about the street maintenance options here, or conditions. Just kind of a general outline of what we're talking about here. We're gonna just kind of give you a review of what we had talked about before, basically, then go into the existing street revenue sources that we have, and then also talk about what we're currently spending for maintenance and capital construction projects, and then comparing the existing funding that's available for streets to the long-term needs to achieve goals that have been identified. So, just as a review, I showed this chart before, showing the condition of streets by classification. So once again, the arterials and collectors are in, the vast majority of them are in fair and good condition. The local streets, that we have a whole bunch in good condition, because most of those streets have been built by recent development of the city. And we have a almost equal amount that are in poor condition with a smaller amount that's fair. So that's kind of a reverse bell curve there as far as street condition on the local streets compared to the arterials and collectors. As we discussed before, we have different options or different treatments that we do for streets depending on their condition. The takeaway here was it's really the worse condition the street is, it's exponentially more expensive to do something to them. Basically, the numbers go up, you had zeros. And we also talked about previously about how pavements deteriorate and how much those costs for those different treatments come in there. Roads don't deteriorate in a straight line. It's kind of this curve here where it takes about 75% of the time to have a 40% quality drop, and then that another 40% quality drop occurs during 17% of the total amount of pavement life. So everything's going along fine, and then it deteriorates rapidly toward the end. And we also talked about overall pavement management strategy, where the cheapest option is to do regular treatments rather than wait and let the road fall apart and just rebuild the pavement over again. Turn it back over to the other Chris.
I do have a question before we move on.
Sure.
Do we have in the military, we had, it's called a PM schedule, where we would have annual, quarterly, semi-annual, monthly, weekly, daily maintenance cards that would have what we needed to do, what machines we need to look at? Is there something like where we have a program that would say, okay, these roads need X every 6 months or X every 5 months or whatever? Is there anything like that, or is it just by complaint or by the traffic plan?
Yeah, so we do, and that's what we use the pavement management system for. Overall, we're inspecting roads and assessing their condition and comparing them to all the other roads. So we can, given the funding that's been available, we're prioritizing which roads we recommend to do which treatments to as part of the capital improvement program.
Okay, thank you.
I think just in that case, those are usually done over a much longer time scale. It's in years, not weeks or months. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yes, please.
I've got a squirrel question. Have we noticed any kind of a compression in deterioration of local streets since the pandemic, when everybody started ordering all these trucks and cars to deliver things to their houses all day long?
Yeah, we haven't seen that yet because we haven't done another pavement inspection. That's not due for another couple of years. So it would be interesting to see if that happened. I don't know, because I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
There's more delivery vehicles that are heavier.
So it's another one's not for a couple of years?
Yeah, so the field inspections that we do to assess, we're right now doing that on a 5-year schedule. And the
That's-
last ones we did was in 2021.
One, I think.
Yeah,
And then the
21.
software predicts the failure or the condition of the street in the intervening years. And then in the 5th year, you go to your actual assessment and it resets the software to the actual conditions.
Thank you.
May I
Yes,
add
please.
something to what
Please.
Counselor Smith just said about, we had a lot of Amazon delivery trucks, or because people were sitting at home ordering stuff. Well, sitting at home, not driving. So I'm wondering if maybe there was any kind of counterbalance in terms of road damage being a little bit less with so fewer cars on the road for a fairly lengthy period of time. I mean, people still drove, but it was a lot less traffic. There were many, many days when it was like a ghost town.
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful that maybe that helped save some of our roads, local, arterial, whatever. I just spilled really bad.
So it could, different kinds of vehicles cause different kinds of damage. The load-related damage are really driven by heavy vehicles, trucks. In that case,
waste.
passenger cars or pickup trucks or SUVs are so much lighter than a garbage truck, for instance, that basically the garbage truck is doing all the damage to the road. You can't have things with studded tires or, that wearing of the surface can be more driven just by the number of trips. So it's kind of like maybe you had one kind of distress increase and the other decrease. So that could, one might partially offset the other. I don't know. I guess
That's
we'll
my
find
hope.
out.
That's my hope. That's all.
Okay, so we're going to move into the discussion of funding here for the bulk of the middle part of the presentation. And one of the things that has come up repeatedly over the last 20 or so years is there's a lack of clarity on how maintenance, operation, and expansion of the street system is funded. So we get a frequent comment on community surveys that we should just do more with the money that we already have. And so one goal of this presentation and of the overall effort with the council and the public is to explain how funding for the street system works and answer questions about how we use our available funding, and then we will define the gap in funding need. So on this table, what we're showing is that we have 4 sources of funding for the entire street fund. We have state gas tax, federal gas tax, which we receive through a program called Surface Transportation Block Grants. And then we have city in lieu of franchise fees and transportation SDCs, and that's it. Most of those funds come with strings attached by law. State gas taxes can only be used to maintain the existing street system, so you can't pay for expansion or growth projects with state gas taxes. The federal funds can only be used on arterials and collectors, not local streets. And SDCI funds, which is one portion and the largest portion of SDCs, can only be used on projects that are identified in the transportation system plan, which only has arterials and collectors, and those projects are associated with growth. So that money cannot be used for routine maintenance. SDCR funds and the in lieu of franchise fee funds are much more flexible, but those are the only sources of funding that we have for things like match for grant projects, studies, certain studies, and then other transportation projects such as maybe a bike path or something along those lines. So these sources, along with any grants that we might get, are what funds all of the work in the street fund, which goes way beyond pavement management, and we'll talk about that as we go along. And I want you to note what is not on the list. There's no revenue here from property taxes or from the private franchise utilities such as the power company or communications companies. All of that revenue goes into the general fund, and the street fund does not receive any revenue from the general fund. One of the items of good news in street funding is that it has been going up slightly since about 2017. At that year, there was a state bill called House Bill 2017, which raised state gas taxes incrementally for a few years. And so our revenue from state gas taxes has gone up accordingly. In lieu of franchise fee revenue has also gone up because we increased the percentage that we apply to water and sewer revenue from 5% to 7%, which matches what we charge the private utilities. So this table is showing average revenue, annual revenue, based on the last 5 fiscal years. So I want to note a couple of things. One, the STBG funds are not received every year. These are the federal funds. We typically get STBG funds every 2 to 3 years as we work on a major capital project that's been awarded those funds. And so on average, in the last 5 years, we received $800,000 per year, but in reality, we get those in larger clumps and therefore specified projects. Secondly, SDC revenue is entirely dependent on development in the city, and so some years we get a lot of SDC funding and other years we get less. And it's also important to remember that SDCI revenue can only be used to pay for growth-related projects, not pavement management projects. So, for instance, a new traffic signal that's required because traffic volumes have increased so much with growth might be 100% eligible for SDCI money, whereas grinding and overlaying a street that needs it might not be eligible for any SDC money. So altogether, we received about $7.8 million each year in revenue over the last 5 years. That funds all activities in the street fund. So when we budget in the city, which I am sure you remember from the water and sewer rate presentations, first we budget for debt service, which we don't have any debt in the street fund, so that's good. Then we budget for operations to keep what we have going, and then anything that's left over goes to capital. So in the street fund, though, it's very much, it's much more complicated because not every source can go every direction. So funding operations, for instance, has to come from only specified sources. So we use state gas tax money to fund operations. We just take the O&M budget off the top of state gas tax revenue, and if there's anything left, we put the remainder over to capital. When I first started doing this about 8 or 10 years ago, we did not receive enough state gas tax money to put any to capital from that source, but now we do have some money. So we put about $1 million to capital from state gas tax money every year. Everything else goes to capital projects, but not every capital project is a pavement management project. And so about $3 million goes to O&M and about $4.8 million went to capital on average annually during these 5 years. So let's see, next. Okay, so this is my slide, not an engineer did not make this slide, and you can tell that I made this slide. So what I'm trying to show here is the further complications of budgeting in the street fund. And on this slide, this is actual budgeted numbers for the current fiscal year, fiscal year 24. And there's 2 big bundles of need. So we have operations on one side, which includes the administrative program. We have a street administrative program, but it is funded as an operational program, so that's lumped together. And then we have capital. So what we did for budgeting for the current year is we took state gas tax revenue, which we expect to receive $4.55 million, and we put most of it to operations and then a little bit to capital. And then we have, in lieu of franchise fee money from water and sewer, we're expecting a little over $2 million. We could put that towards operations, but it's 100% going to capital. And then we have the state, or the STBG money, which is the federal funding for projects that can only be spent on arterials and collectors. We're budgeting to receive $1.56 million this year. Remember, the average was $800,000, and this is the one that comes kind of in clumps. And this is for the Queen Avenue project. And then we have SDCs. So SDCs are pointing at capital, but they're not really capital. So SDCI revenue, we're anticipating spending $600,000 in SDCI revenue this year, and that is for a study of the Highway 20 corridor through downtown so that we can plan for improvements there. And then we have SDCR money, which is quite flexible, but we don't have a lot of it. And so this year we're budgeting to spend $150,000 on ADA improvements that are needed in the right-of-way. That's really, between the SDCR and the in lieu of franchise fee money, the only way we could pay for those types of projects. So It's a lot of money, but it has to go a lot of different places, and it's complicated, and that's what I'm trying to get across with this slide. It's a mess. Yeah.
Counselor Montague, or is that?
Are the ADA upgrades in that 150K, is that for locals, or is that going to arterials and collectors?
It could be either. These are projects that were identified in the self-evaluation and transition plan. And so we have a list of needed improvements. I don't even know what the total dollar amount is. It's huge. And so we are trying to make some progress on that list, but we also address complaint. So this is a very complaint-driven program typically. So for instance, if we get a complaint about a specific curb ramp, it could be a local street or it could be an arterial. We've done ADA projects on Geary Street, which is an arterial or collector depending on where you are. And we've also done them on, 7th or somewhere over here in the neighborhood here. So it just depends where those are.
So is there anticipation that ODOT will be doing more ADA upgrades? At least that's what I'm hearing from the CWAC, is that with the upcoming STIP, that most of that is going to be going to ADA upgrades, but I don't know how much of that is flowing to us.
Chris might know more about that. I don't know if those are limited to ODOT right-of-way facilities.
Okay.
Do you know?
Yeah, my understanding is that's for ADA improvements on the state highway system. So there may be probably some of those improvements will be in Albany, but they'll be on like Highway 99E or Highway 20.
Okay, so as I've said multiple times, the council and staff have been discussing this problem since at least 1982. And so I wanted to show one historic comparison, and I somewhat randomly picked fiscal year '06 because it's the furthest back budget that we have on our city website. And so since that time, street maintenance has added 3/4 of an FTE, which in reality, we've added one person to the street maintenance crew, and then we rebudgeted the supervisor partially. It now is paid out of the airport, so we've added one person on the street maintenance crew. In the same time period, we've lost one engineer, so we're actually down an engineer right now. Comparatively, the city has grown by about 52 FTE. In 2006, we were spending $1.3 million on capital projects. In this current fiscal year, we're budgeting for $5.2 million. That's a wide range of things, not necessarily pavement management type projects. And so we've increased quite a bit in our capital spending, but the O&M spending has not increased by very much. So to talk a little bit about the capital spending, the reason that number has gone up so much is because we're dedicating state gas tax money and in lieu of franchise fee money to capital projects, and to try to raise our arterial and collector PCI above 60, which was a strategic plan goal set for us from the council. So that has been our target, and it's where we've been spending our money. On the O&M side, we've tried to control our costs, so we have not raised that budget very much. So for instance, the CPI has gone up 55% since 2005, but funding for street maintenance has only gone up 21%. So you can see in the spending here that we have really been focusing on getting money into street capital to try to construct some projects, which does include some pavement management, but mostly we've been targeting arterial and collectors. And so that's has resulted in the PCI scores that Chris showed earlier. So again, I want to emphasize that the money that we get in the street fund has to fund every single thing we do in streets. And so I want to talk a little bit about what else we do and to try to get to the concern that we aren't effectively using the money that we have. So I'm going to talk a little bit about street operations. So our street maintenance crew does do some pavement management work, and those are listed on the left side here. So typically every year we contract with Lynn County to provide chip seal on roads that are appropriate for chip seal, which are roads that we would call they're not improved to urban standards, so they don't have curb and gutter. They're usually in really small neighborhoods. There's some near the wastewater treatment plant, some others around town that are appropriate for chip seal. So that provides a new driving surface. It might not address any underlying foundational problems in the road, but it improves the road and helps sustain it. We also do some pavement repair, so this will be the paving machine, the famous Pavey McPayface paving machine. These are small patches. I'll show a picture of one in a little bit. Also would be like potholes, anything that has to do with asphalt repair would be in that dollar figure. But most of what street maintenance does is everything else. So there's a long list here. This is not everything, but I'll talk about a few of these things. So street sweeping. Street sweeping takes more than one full-time position each year. So we have one person every day that we have a sweeper that works. We have one person who is sweeping streets. Last time we calculated, it was about 1.25 FTE to sweep all the streets in town. So more than a full-time job. We have painting. We paint the curbs, the pavement markings for railroad crossings and crosswalks. We do street center lines, which we contract out for that work. Typically curb painting and crack sealing, which is another pavement management task I didn't list here, is done in the summer by temporary employees. We used to hire 15 or 16 temps, but temps are expensive now, and to control costs, we hire fewer temps and do more work with our in-house staff. We have signs and signals. We have over 7,800 street signs, and I know that number because they're all tagged and tracked. We have 22 traffic signals. And then the last thing I'll touch on is streetlights. Streetlights used to be paid 100% from the general fund about 15 or so years ago. And then they were 50% paid for by the street fund, and then the very next year, 100% paid for by the street fund. So, and that was because the general fund couldn't afford it. There were other priorities that the council wanted the general fund to pay for. And so that shifted to streets. So we spent, before the current year, we spent about $500,000 a year on streetlights. So more money than we spend on slurry sealing and some other pavement management programs we spent on streetlights. Last year, we, as the council knows, we switched our PP&L streetlights over to LEDs. We took money from the street capital fund to pay for that initially, but we expect to save about $100,000 per year in streetlight costs. So I have some pictures here because pictures are better than words. On the top side, you'll see crack sealing. We have our own crack sealing equipment, and on the left side, you can see where one side of the street has been crack sealed and the other side is yet to be done. So that's what crack sealing looks like. We also repair potholes. Last year, we repaired over 5,000 potholes. We do track our repairs in a customer service asset system. And on this slide, we have a major sidewalk failure that the street crew fixed. At the top, you can see sort of the in progress and then the finished product. On the bottom pictures is a curb and gutter repair. So on the left-hand side, you can see that there really is not a curb anymore on this street. And so the street crew rebuilt the curb, gutter, and sidewalk, and then put down a large asphalt patch. So that's what our typical asphalt patching projects look like. They're 1 lane width or less, and that covered up a whole bunch of alligator cracks and other things that were wrong with that asphalt. Didn't fix the underlying problem, but it helped preserve the life of that street. We paint all of the crosswalks and railroad markings with reflective paint. There are laws that govern reflectivity in asphalt markings and street signs, in case you didn't know. We have our own sign shop, which is a huge benefit, and we can get new signs up and installed very quickly. I don't know how many signs we have to turn over every year, but as I said, we have 7,800 signs in Albany. We have 22 traffic signals. We contract with ODOT for the technicians who are specially trained to manage and program the traffic signals, but we pay for all of the materials. So whenever a signal box like this one gets damaged or destroyed, we have to pay to replace that. We also have to upgrade the controllers. We have, I don't know, a dozen or so right now that are obsolete that we have to upgrade the guts on. And then we do things like street sweeping. As I mentioned, we manage street trees in partnership with Parks and Rec. We try to fix sidewalk panels as we can, although they're typically the responsibility of the adjacent property owner. But we remove debris. We try to temporarily fix sidewalks where we can. We clean up the right-of-way, and street maintenance is responsible for ditches and culverts. So they work to keep the water off the streets. So last slide for me. When we talk about the available revenue for pavement management, this slide is referring back to the earlier table at the beginning, but we've taken out some of the things that don't work here. So transportation SDCI is not in here. Because it can't be used for pavement management. And I've also subtracted out a reserve. We do try to maintain a reserve in our capital program. So the result is, of that $7.8 million, in the last 5 years, on average, we had about $3.1 million to use towards pavement projects. And so that's the number we're starting with. And then Chris is going to talk about what the modeling results showed and define what we call the funding gap, which was how much we need per year versus how much we have per year. And so I'll turn it back over to Chris.
All righty. Well, we'll start with the arterials and collectors. That's it started out with before. So arterials and collectors, looking at what needs to be done in order to meet the strategic plan goal of that PCI of 60. Looking over the long term, you need to spend about $4 million a year on pavement maintenance. And right now we're spending about $2.5 million on pavement maintenance, which means that we're $1.5 million a year short to reach that goal. That number is coming from reconstructing all of the remaining segments of arterial and collectors that are in poor conditions or poor condition, and then doing a grind and overlay project on every arterial and collector every 20 years to keep on that top part of that deterioration curve. And the current funding for that is coming from the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, the state gas tax, and the water and sewer in lieu of franchise fees. Going over to local streets, because that local streets were in that kind of two-mode condition with a big amount in poor and a big amount in good. We've broken those into two different strategies or needs that, as we talked before, it's much more cost-effective to keep good and fair roads in good and fair condition than it is to let them fall off the cliff into poor condition. And so if we just look at the roads that are currently in good and fair condition, what does it take to keep them in good and fair condition? And so looking at that, we need about $3.5 million a year to keep those streets in good and fair condition. Right now, we're spending $500,000 a year, which is going to our slurry seal program. And so we're $3 million a year short in order to meet that goal. And those funds.
Quick question.
Sure.
Does for both the arterial collectors and the local streets, your long range forecast, is that factoring in inflation in any way, shape, or form for the costs?
No, these are all in current day dollars.
Current day dollars, thank you.
And these costs for good and fair streets is assuming that we're gonna do a grind and inlay on every good and every one of these streets every 40 years on average, and slurry seal all of the streets every 20 years, including the ones that are in poor condition, so we can do something to them to kind of slow them down a little bit. And funding for these currently is coming from state gas taxes and the water and sewer in lieu of franchise fees. Because those other,
Counselor Smith has a question.
oh, yeah.
Would you ever slurry seal a failed street? It
We-
doesn't seem there to be much point in that, does there?
Right, so we have in the past, depending on what's failed about it, there are streets where, are you gonna get as much benefit out of doing that as you would on a street that was in good condition? No, but it does do something. It does, if anything, it holds the pieces together a little bit. You're not gonna get, it's not gonna last that 20 years or 15 years, but it will do something. There are streets that we did that to in the past, and roads that we didn't do that, and the ones that we did slurry seal are currently in better condition than the ones that we didn't. If anything, just because the surface is a little smoother.
Thank you.
I have a question. This big push to go to electric vehicles, EVs, those vehicles are heavier than the gas cars, so the batteries, I think, that's what I was told.
Yes.
So, and also we're losing the gas tax funds as those come online. Have you heard anything about the next piece of
I
this?
forgot again, I forgot at the Transportation Commission to give my disclaimer at the beginning. It will be important for us to assume that the state finds a way to replace gas tax money as the state begins to switch to non-fossil fuel vehicles. So that is an underlying assumption as we go forward in these discussions, is we need to assume that the state will develop a mechanism. I don't know what the mechanism will be I don't know how they're gonna do it. But I think we should assume that they're going to come up with a way to keep the receipts for state gas tax revenue somewhat stable as people begin to transition to alternate fuel vehicles. And we need to assume that our fair share of that state revenue, that whatever the gas tax becomes, stays somewhat predictable. And the reason I say that is, number one, we can get down a rabbit hole of discussing how they should do that. That's not for us. We're not going to figure that out. But also, if they don't figure out a way to maintain that state gas tax revenue and that we continue to get this sort of relative amount, our situation becomes that much worse.
Yes, I agree.
So we're just going to assume that the state figures it out, and whatever mechanism they use continues to deliver a similar amount of funding to us. If they don't, our situation is even
Dire,
worse. So
yeah.
I think we'll let,
Good,
unless
thank
there's
you.
another question, let
Thank
Chris.
I have a question, but it's not regarding that.
Okay.
It was about when you talked about the potholes or fixing the potholes from the previous thing you just talked about.
Mhm.
Do you guys do that in parking lots too?
Only city-owned parking lots will
Okay.
maintained. We don't maintain private parking lots.
Okay.
We get that complaint a lot, and
Me
we just
too.
have to
I'm getting that
refer that
complaint.
back to the property owner.
Particularly the Winco parking lot, I think.
Oh, gosh, yeah, that's one of them.
That's
Yeah.
a newer parking lot too.
Or when you come in, it's just a big old pothole there.
Oh, really?
Turning in, and I've gotten, I don't know if Councilor Smith have gotten emails regarding that, but so many about that.
Yeah. That road also over there is a little private road by McDonald's. We get complaints about that road too. That's not our road, so anyway, sorry, Chris.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Got that already. Then if you look at the local streets that are in poor condition, these are the ones that there's nothing else you can do but reconstruct the pavement at this point. These are the expensive ones. Basically here, because reconstruction is the only maintenance option at this point because of their condition. We looked at over a 40-year period, if you were going to reconstruct all of the poor local streets, you would have to spend $8.3 million a year for 40 years to tackle all of those. Currently, we're spending $0 reconstructing those streets, so that full $8.3 million would be the annual shortfall. And again, that would be assuming that you were actually going to tackle 100% of the failed streets. And so that would be a discussion for probably the next meeting, as to figuring out what the council's goal would be. 100% is a big thing to chew off, or do we want to do any or some smaller amount? But we'll discuss that more at a future meeting, because this is the
Chris,
scale of the issue. Yeah.
So you said 1.3 million for the next 40 years?
Yes.
Yes. It's $300 and some odd million problem. Yeah, so as Chris said, this is not our recommendation, okay? We're not suggesting that, because if you go to the next slide, it adds up to $12 million a year for 40 years. So that's not realistic, feasible, and not what we recommend, but that is the problem. So it's important, I think, for you and for the community to understand the scale of the problem. So our, $3 million a year is a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, to us individually. It's not even a drop in the bucket to try to resolve this problem. So what we're going to do at the next meeting is talk about some strategies of how do we start to begin to address our funding shortfall, and how, if, to what degree the council wants to do this. So we'll be talking about that next time.
May I add something? Because I don't know, even though we're going to discuss the funding next time, I might forget this. So I want to say it now, if I may. You had mentioned that funding for lighting came out of the street funds, and now we're going to be saving some money on the lights. Could we at least assume that we might possibly be able to put those savings from the different lights into the street fund?
Yeah, so it's not savings in that we're going to accrue revenue. It's that we spend less.
Yeah, but see, we spend less. So if we
Yep.
spend less,
So
that
we're
would be
in good
money that
shape.
can go
Yeah, so
hopefully back to streets.
So it's $100,000 a year, in today's dollars, and we'll continue to look for options like that. But that's only going to buy us a little bit of time before that.
I know that's
yeah.
not much, but I'm also thinking of suggesting, which I think I will remember when we discuss the finance of it, is seeing if we couldn't find a way to work it back into the general fund, even in the smallest percentage, 1% or something,
So the discussion of options next time will include a little more history on how the general fund and the street fund have, been related in the past. And we'll talk about that. The thing to keep in mind, and I'm certainly not going to say that we need to take money from the general fund for streets. That is not my decision to make at all. Whatever you take from the general fund means that you're cutting a service in the general fund. So there's no extra general fund money right now, which is why streets got sort of pushed out of the general fund, is because it used to be funded wholly in the general fund, but as the need for those revenues grew and the actual revenues didn't grow as fast, things got pushed out. And so streets is one of those things. So we'll talk about that more next time. And there are options. There's definitely, this is going to be one of the harder decisions probably that the council is going to have to discuss and make, because there's not an easy answer, and everything affects every person in the city in various ways. But we will talk about that. So just to try to wrap up, just a reminder of the deterioration curve. The best way to maintain our streets, the most cost-effective way, is to just reset that deterioration curve as much as we can. We have been targeting our investments in arterials and collectors, and you can see that in the PCI rating, and that there's only a very small percentage of arterials and collectors that are in poor condition. Over the past 5 years, we got about $7.8 million to fund all of the street activities. And just a reminder that pavement management is only one part of what we do. And so the total funding gap was $12.8 million per year for 40 years in today's dollars. That's not what we are going to be asking for. We certainly would not recommend anything approaching that. But we do need to, I think, develop a strategy to talk about local streets.
I hear a lot about local.
When I first presented this in August and said we're going to start this again, I talked about some of what happened in the past and how our efforts have failed in the past. And I really think that part of the reason we haven't been super successful is we have not had a coherent and transparent strategy to talk about local streets, because people want their local street to be better. But there's such limited funds that we've only targeted the main streets. And so we have to talk about local streets. Now, what you choose to do with local streets is up to you, but it needs to be part of the discussion. So we'll be talking about that next time. Speaking of which, we did present this to the TAC. They had lots of good questions. I think Chuck is here, but I'm not sure if anybody else from the TAC is here. And they had lots of good suggestions also about how to prioritize our limited funds. And so it was a really good meeting. We'll be talking about the next funding alternatives discussion with them at the end of November. And then we'll be back here in early December with the same or similar presentation. So with that, we can answer whatever other questions you might have.
Council?
I have
Councilor Novak?
one last question, and forgive me if this is way off base, but we had that gentleman earlier talking about investments and how well our investments are doing. Can we tap into that? That's,
Oh, the interest, you mean?
it's,
Interesting.
yeah. I'm just wondering, because that's doing well. I want to throw that out there, so again, in case I
Yeah.
don't remember for next time.
I mean, I feel like whatever you want to be on the table is on the table.
Okay.
I can talk with Gina a little bit more to understand better how our investment returns are currently used and what that looks like. But again, it's sort of a zero fund game unless there's a new source. So whatever you take away, like if that investment return is going to the general fund and we want to redirect that towards streets, we have to figure out what to do with the general fund that would lose that amount. So, but for sure, I think I'll talk with Gina and see what happens there. I'm not
Because it wouldn't
quite
be
sure.
losing an amount. The general fund wouldn't be losing it. It just wouldn't be getting it. Right?
Yes, but they count on that, I guess. So I don't know. I'll talk with Gina.
And streets were in the general fund
Yeah.
before they weren't. I mean, I don't know. I just don't want to create a new fee for people
Sure.
who are strapped, because, again, I spoke earlier, and I won't say any more about that. I'm loath to put another something
Yeah.
on people.
That came out with that from the TAC as well.
Yeah.
Just to add something to keep in mind, the investment income that you heard earlier, when you consider that, you have to think about the fact that we won't always be getting those same returns. So in terms of predictability, and it's a good idea to look into using them, but for sustainability, that might not.
I understand. I'm just looking at more stopgappy something so that we don't have, because I understand, these are excellent presentations, Director, and I have a much better understanding of the issues with the streets and, all of this. It's really helping me a lot. And I also want to say that your drawing was great. I understand your art. I do.
Oh,
I
good.
thought, you were denigrating it, and I'm like, don't do that. It's good. It's good. So I'm
It's
telling you
just
now.
a different way of looking
So
at it.
Counselor Kopczynski has had his hand up for a while.
Okay, lower my hand here. Okay, thank you, Chris, for the presentations that you've been making and trying to make even over the years. Many times I keep driving people towards the city's website for what the information about city streets is. And it's rare, I honestly say this, it's rare when I pass on the information that I ever get a response or a reply from people, even though you're giving them the facts. It's basically the message I get back is, I don't care. I want my street fixed in my house, in front of my house. So that's the contention that we'll have to deal with and trying to figure out how to
Yeah.
mitigate it with as minimal pain as possible. But you can guarantee it's going to cost a lot of money to fix the streets, period. And we're not alone. I mean, almost every community in the state, I'm sure, is going to these same kind of struggles. So I'd like to know a city that is not and try and see if we can emulate some of their stuff. But there it is, and I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Ray. Counselor Kupczynski, that's my neighbor, I'm sorry. Counselor Kupczynski. Maryland, Counselor Smith had a comment or question.
Yeah, thank you for calling on Counselor Kopsinski first, because my mind went blank for a moment. Two things. I wanted to mention that I think it was the streetlight portion of the street fund that was the last thing that got kicked out of the general fund related to street maintenance.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's been when Diane Dennis was here.
Yes, 15 years maybe.
Yeah. The other thing was, I have attended 2 of the League of Oregon Cities state conferences in the last year, and City Hall Day at the state capitol in January. At each one of those sessions, how to replace the gas tax has been a topic that and ODOT is all over it. The league is all over it. Everybody is trying to figure out how to keep the cities whole as that trickles away. It's on the radar.
Yeah, and in addition, the mayor's conference, we did the same thing. We had a whole discussion about the gas tax and a few other things.
Yeah,
Councilor
we
Montague.
discussed it at length in CWAC as well. So it's on ODOT's radar, but
Yeah.
I don't know if they have a solution, but you know, I agree with you that we just need to assume that we're going to figure something out, because that's the only way we can go forward.
Right.
Because otherwise we're just guessing.
Counselor?
And
at what
ODOT
we're
is
getting.
the most affected of anybody as those revenues drop.
I have a friend, an engineer, scientist that has some ideas about that. So it's
Well,
really
you should talk to ODOT.
Okay, is
All
that
right,
it?
well, thank you. We'll be back in a month or so to talk about the next step.
Thank you so much, Director.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Next up is business from the council, and I will have Counselor Kopczynski go first.
Well, I think I just said my piece, so I'm good.
Okay, Counselor Montague.
So like I said, I attended CWAC meeting, which is Cascades West Area Transportation Group. We talked about the upcoming 2027 to 2030 STIP, which is the State Transportation Improvement Program. And during that discussion, what I learned was that the funds for that will be projected 7% lower than the previous STIP. And that they will be focusing a significant amount of that's $625 million out of the $2.9 billion, will be dedicated to ADA curb ramp projects, and then also including repaying bonds for those projects, previous projects. And that they will be using about 40% of that for the Fix-It program. So this is for the state road. So again, as Chris indicated, that's going to be, 99 or 20. But hopefully we'll see some of that. This is just a draft right now, so they haven't finalized it, but more to come.
Thank you for that. Counselor Newton.
I have nothing.
Fantastic. Counselor Smith.
I have been invited to be part of the committee that's reviewing the final applications for spending the money that we're receiving from the state, Lynn County's receiving from the state for rapid rehousing and additional shelter beds from the governor's emergency order from earlier this year. Our committee's meeting on Wednesday. We have applications from, I believe, 7 service providers in Lynn County. I haven't seen them yet, but I'll be taking a look tomorrow.
Thank you. Counselor Novak.
Yes, I actually have an apology to I don't know who. I received a couple of phone calls to my city number in the last week, And I thought, that's odd, why didn't they leave a message? It took me a while to ascertain that my voicemail was full. So I apologize that whoever tried to call couldn't leave a message. I'm usually a little bit easier to reach, and I have taken care of the issue. So I don't even know if that individual or whoever, if it was more than one, if they would be watching or listening, but I am sorry, and I'll stay on top of it better in the future.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Counselor Novak. And with that, I have stuff for Wednesday night, and I will be turning over to the city manager.
And I have
You
nothing to
just
add.
forgot about me? It's
Oh, I
fine.
thought I asked her. No, I'm
No,
sorry.
no, no.
No, I didn't. Oh,
I'll reserve it for Wednesday. Don't worry.
is that, I am so sorry.
I see how it is. It's
Okay. Not on me, I'm sorry.
I'm gonna hold you to it.
Forgive me, I'm sorry. You're killing me. City manager?
I have nothing further, Mayor. Thank you.
And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. I could have sworn I looked.